The encounter that changed everything. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the window blinds of Catherine Maxwell's sprawling Manhattan penthouse. The room reflected her status. Polished hardwood floors, a breathtaking skyline view, and minimalist furnishings exuding sophistication. Catherine woke at 5:00 a.m., her schedule already planned the second. She rolled out of her king-size bed, her silk pajamas sliding effortlessly over her toned frame. Success was her lifestyle, and she relished in it. Catherine wasn't just a CEO. She was the CEO of Maxwell Enterprises, a billion-dollar conglomerate. Her company's reach extended into finance, technology, and even real estate development. Every decision she made could shift markets and futures. Yet, despite her accomplishments, her life felt increasingly hollow. She'd recently noticed how easily others catered to her needs, yet true human connection seemed absent. By 7:00 a.m., she was seated in her custom-designed Tesla, her assistant texting reminders about the morning's meetings. A deal with foreign investors was on the table, her chance to expand Maxwell Enterprises into untapped markets in Asia. She had no intention of letting traffic slow her down. The chauffeur was off-duty that day, but Catherine didn't mind. She enjoyed the sensation of controlling the car, a rare indulgence in a life meticulously managed by others. As she approached her office building in Midtown, frustration bubbled under the surface. Construction work nearby had reduced the parking spaces, and the lot was packed. Catherine circled once, twice, scanning for an empty spot close to the entrance. Her tailored Valentino heels weren't meant for trekking across parking lots. Finally, she spotted a prime space by the entrance, marked with a distinct blue and white sign, reserved for veterans. Catherine hesitated only for a moment before rationalizing her decision. Just this once, she thought. What are the odds a veteran will show up needing this spot today? Catherine stepped out of her car, her Louboutin heels clicking against the pavement as she strode toward the building. The chill in the autumn air barely registered as she mentally rehearsed the points she'd emphasized during her meeting. That was when she heard a deep, firm voice behind her. "Excuse me, ma'am." Catherine turned, mildly annoyed at the interruption. A man stood a few paces away, his broad shoulders squared and arms crossed over his chest. His presence was commanding, even intimidating. Dressed in a simple black leather jacket and jeans, his salt and pepper hair betrayed his years, but his posture screamed discipline. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers. "Yes?" she asked curtly, her irritation creeping into her voice. "That spot," he said, nodding toward her car. "It's reserved for veterans. Are you one?" Catherine stiffened. "No," she replied, "but I'm running late for an important meeting. There's no other parking available." The man didn't flinch, his expression remaining calm but resolute. "My name is Commander Andrew Blake, U.S. Navy SEAL, retired. That spot is for people who've served this country, not for convenience." Catherine bristled. Who did this man think he was? "Listen, Commander Blake," she began, emphasizing his title with a trace of mockery. "I understand this is reserved, but as I said, it's a one-time thing. I doubt anyone will even notice." Blake stepped closer, his demeanor unwavering. "It's not about whether someone notices. It's about respect," he said firmly. "That space represents more than just a parking spot. It's a small acknowledgement of sacrifices you can't even begin to comprehend." Catherine's polished corporate facade cracked, revealing a flicker of unease. Few people ever challenged her, and fewer still did so without backing down. "Sacrifices," she scoffed, attempting to regain control. "I've worked harder than most to get where I am today. Don't lecture me about sacrifices." Blake's jaw tightened, but his voice remained measured. "Let me tell you about sacrifices, Ms. Maxwell. I've seen men and women leave their families, miss the births of their children, and put their lives on the line in ways you couldn't fathom. Some came back broken, physically, mentally, or both. Others didn't come back at all. That spy out there, it's one of the few ways society says, 'We see you. We value you.'" Catherine opened her mouth to respond but stopped. His words hit harder than she cared to admit. The confidence she exuded in boardrooms and interviews faltered under his unwavering gaze. She glanced toward her car, suddenly feeling exposed. I didn't think of it that way," she admitted, her voice softer than before. "I'm sorry if I offended you." Blake's stance relaxed slightly, but his eyes remained on her. "It's not about offending me. It's about doing what's right. That spot is for someone who's given more than you can imagine. I'd appreciate it if you moved your car." For a moment, Catherine considered arguing further, but something about Blake's presence, his conviction, made her hesitate. She sighed, fishing her keys out of her designer handbag. "Fine," she said, her tone clipped. "I'll move it." As she turned back toward her car, she felt Blake's gaze follow her. It wasn't hostile, but it was resolute. The kind of gaze that came from years of leading people in life-or-death situations. Catherine backed her Tesla out of the veteran's space and parked farther away, her heels clicking louder against the pavement as she walked back toward the building. She didn't glance back at Blake, but his words echoed in her mind. Something about the way he spoke, the weight of his experience, the calm firmness of his conviction, lingered with her. What she didn't realize was that this encounter was the first crack in the armor she built around herself. It was a crack that would widen in ways she couldn't yet imagine, reshaping her priorities and redefining her concept of success. Inside her office, Catherine went through the motions of her day: meetings, negotiations, and conference calls. But her usual focus was absent. Her thoughts kept returning to the man in the parking lot. She didn't know it yet, but Commander Andrew Blake would become the catalyst for a transformation she didn't even realize she needed. The invitation that sparked change. The following week, Catherine Maxwell found herself unable to shake the memory of Commander Andrew Blake. His words, his unwavering stance, and the weight behind his calm demeanor haunted her thoughts. For a woman used to being the most powerful voice in the room, his challenge had been unsettling. It wasn't just that he'd confronted her, it was the truth in his words. She tried to push it aside as she returned to her usual routine, burying herself in the minutiae of corporate life. Her days were filled with board meetings, strategy sessions, and power lunches. She excelled in every interaction, but an unfamiliar feeling of emptiness persisted. Late at night, as she stared out from her penthouse balcony at the sprawling city below, she couldn't help but wonder if she had been missing something crucial. A week after their encounter, Catherine found a plain envelope in her mailbox, handwritten with no return address. It was unusual. Most of her correspondence came via email or through assistants. Curious, she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing a simple message. "Ms. Maxwell, I hope this letter finds you well. After our brief exchange, I thought you might appreciate seeing what that parking spot truly represents. This Saturday, I'll be hosting a fundraiser for the Veterans Transition Alliance, a nonprofit organization I run to support veterans as they reintegrate into civilian life. You're invited. It's not a formal affair, just a gathering of people who care deeply about the men and women who have served this country. I think you might find it enlightening. The details are below. No need to RSVP. Come as you are, or not at all. Respectfully, Commander Andrew Blake, retired. Veterans Transition Alliance." Catherine frowned as she read the letter again. It wasn't an invitation so much as a challenge. The tone was polite, but it carried the same quiet firmness she remembered from their first encounter. For the next few days, she debated whether to attend. A part of her bristled at the idea of showing up. She didn't like being made to feel small or unimportant. Yet, another part of her was intrigued. The fundraiser wasn't about rubbing elbows with society's elite or gaining a new business connection. It was something else entirely, something outside her carefully constructed world. Saturday arrived, and Catherine found herself pacing her penthouse. Her assistant had scheduled a dinner meeting with a key investor, but she'd rescheduled it last minute, offering only a vague excuse. Now she stood in front of her closet, hesitating. The usual designer outfits stared back at her: Armani suits, Valentino dresses, Prada heels. None of them seemed appropriate. After some deliberation, she chose a simple navy blouse and a pair of tailored jeans, clothes she hadn't worn in years. Slipping into a pair of flats, she caught her reflection in the mirror. She looked different, less polished, more human. The change unsettled her, but she pushed the thought aside. The address in the letter led her to a modest community center on the outskirts of the city. Catherine pulled her Tesla into the small gravel lot, noting the difference from the sleek parking garages she was used to. Several cars were already there, many of them old trucks or sedans adorned with military decals and bumper stickers that read "Proud Veteran" or "Support Our Troops." As she stepped out of her car, she felt an unfamiliar sense of vulnerability. There was no security detail, no assistant to smooth the way. It was just her. The hum of laughter and conversation drifted from the building. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward the entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and inviting. Long tables were set up with simple, home-cooked dishes, casseroles, roasted chicken, and baskets of fresh bread. A group of veterans mingled, some in wheelchairs, others with prosthetic limbs, and many with smiles that belied the stories etched into their faces. Families were scattered throughout, children darting between the adults. The air was alive with a sense of camaraderie that Catherine found both foreign and comforting. She spotted Commander Blake near the center of the room, speaking with a young man in a wheelchair. Blake was smiling, his hand resting lightly on the man's shoulder as he listened intently. Catherine hesitated, unsure if she should interrupt. Before she could decide, Blake turned and spotted her. His eyes widened briefly in surprise, but his expression quickly shifted to one of welcome. He excused himself from his conversation and approached her. "Ms. Maxwell," he said, his tone as calm and steady as she remembered. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I wasn't sure either," Catherine admitted, her voice quieter than usual. She glanced around the room. "This is different from what I expected." Blake's lips quirked into a small smile. "Not quite a corporate gala, is it?" She shook her head, feeling a faint blush rise to her cheeks. "No, it's not. But that's not a bad thing." Blake gestured toward a nearby table. "Why don't we sit? I'd like to introduce you to someone." They made their way to the table, where a man in his mid-30s sat with his wife and young daughter. The man's left leg was missing below the knee, replaced by a sleek prosthetic. Despite this, his smile was broad and genuine. "Ms. Maxwell, this is Sergeant David Carter," Blake said. David served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He's one of the first people the Veterans Transition Alliance helped. David extended his hand, and Catherine shook it, feeling the strength in his grip. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Ms. Maxwell," he said. "Commander Blake told me about your spirited conversation last week." Catherine winced slightly, but David's warm tone eased her discomfort. "It wasn't my finest moment," she admitted. David chuckled. "Hey, we all have those. The important thing is what we do after." As the evening progressed, Catherine listened to stories from David and other veterans. They spoke of their struggles transitioning back to civilian life, finding work, dealing with PTSD, and navigating a world that often felt foreign after their experiences in combat. For the first time, Catherine began to grasp the enormity of the sacrifices these men and women had made. One story stood out in particular: a young woman named Alina, who had served as a medic in Iraq. She described how the Veterans Transition Alliance had helped her find housing after losing her job and nearly ending up homeless. Catherine was struck by the resilience and gratitude in Alina's voice. By the end of the night, Catherine felt a deep shift within her. She had spent years building her empire, believing she understood the challenges of leadership and sacrifice. But the stories she'd heard tonight made her realize how narrow her perspective had been. As the crowd began to disperse, Catherine approached Blake. "Commander," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Thank you for inviting me. Tonight has been eye-opening." Blake studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. I'm glad you came. But the question is, what are you going to do with what you've learned? Catherine hesitated. For once, she didn't have an immediate answer, but as she left the community center and drove home, she couldn't stop thinking about his question. What would she do with what she had learned? That night, as she stared out over the city lights, Catherine felt something stir within her, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She didn't know exactly what her next steps would be, but she knew one thing for certain. Her life was about to change. A seed of purpose. The following week, Catherine Maxwell found herself in a place she hadn't been in years, uncertain about her next move. For someone who had built an empire on decisiveness, it was a strange and unsettling feeling. Her schedule was still full. Meetings, investor calls, strategy sessions, but they felt hollow. The stories from the fundraiser lingered, especially Commander Blake's parting words. What are you going to do with what you've learned? Those words replayed in her mind during her morning runs, her board meetings, even in the rare moments of stillness she allowed herself. Catherine had built her life on the principle that success was measurable. Profits, stock prices, market share. But for the first time, she felt the weight of a question she couldn't quantify. Was her success meaningful? The first step. By midweek, Catherine decided to take the first step toward answering that question. She called her assistant, Monica, into her office. Monica. Catherine began, leaning forward at her glass desk. I need a list of organizations focused on veteran services, particularly those involved in housing, job training, and mental health. Monica blinked, clearly caught off guard. Of course, Ms. Maxwell. May I ask what this is for? Catherine hesitated. She hadn't shared her thoughts with anyone yet, unsure how they'd be received. It's a personal project, she said finally. And make sure to include the Veterans Transition Alliance. I'd like to learn more about their operations. Monica nodded, though her brow furrowed slightly. Catherine's request was unusual, but she wasn't about to question her boss. That evening, Catherine sat in her penthouse with a glass of wine and a stack of reports on various veteran-focused nonprofits. She read story after story of challenges faced by veterans: homelessness, joblessness, untreated PTSD. The statistics were staggering. Nearly 10% of veterans experienced homelessness at some point in their lives. Many struggled to find jobs that matched their skill sets. And then there was the mental toll. Suicide rates among veterans were far higher than the national average. The more Catherine read, the more her chest tightened. She thought of David Carter, Elena, and the others she had met at the fundraiser. Their stories had faces now, and those faces had names. She couldn't ignore them, not anymore. Reaching out. 2 days later, Catherine picked up the phone and dialed the number for the Veterans Transition Alliance. A receptionist answered, her voice warm but professional. Veterans Transition Alliance, how can I assist you? This is Catherine Maxwell, she said. I'd like to speak with Commander Andrew Blake. There was a brief pause. One moment, Ms. Maxwell. I'll see if he's available. A few minutes later, Blake's familiar voice came through the line. Ms. Maxwell, this is unexpected. Catherine smiled faintly. I've been thinking a lot since the fundraiser. I'd like to learn more about what your organization does and how I might be able to help. Blake was silent for a moment, and Catherine could almost hear him weighing her sincerity. All right, he said finally. Why don't you come by the office tomorrow? I'll show you what we do. A new world. The next day, Catherine arrived at the Veterans Transition Alliance headquarters, a modest 2-story building on the edge of the city. It was a far cry from the gleaming skyscrapers she was used to, but it had a sense of purpose she couldn't deny. Blake greeted her at the door, his handshake firm as ever. Welcome to the Alliance, he said. Let me show you around. He led her through the building, explaining their programs as they went. The first stop was the Job Training Center, where veterans were learning everything from computer programming to skilled trades. Catherine watched as a former Marine practiced welding under the guidance of an instructor. The man's focus and determination were palpable. We focus on practical skills, Blake explained, things that translate directly to civilian jobs. Many of these folks already have leadership and problem-solving abilities. What they need is a bridge to the civilian workforce. Next, they visited the Housing Assistance Office, where caseworkers were helping veterans navigate the complexities of finding affordable homes. One caseworker, a petite woman with glasses, was on the phone advocating for a veteran who had been denied a rental application due to his credit score. "It's not just about providing housing," Blake said. "It's about giving people the tools to rebuild their lives." Finally, they stopped by the counseling center. A young woman in a military uniform was speaking with a therapist, her voice low but steady. Catherine noticed the faint tremor in her hands as she gestured. "PTSD is one of the biggest challenges veterans face," Blake said quietly. "It's invisible, but it's devastating. We provide therapy, support groups, and even alternative treatments like art and music therapy." By the end of the tour, Catherine felt overwhelmed. The scope of the challenges veterans faced, and the Alliance's efforts to address them, was staggering. But what struck her most was the passion of the people working there. This wasn't just a job for them, it was a mission. The proposal. As they returned to Blake's office, Catherine sat down across from him, her mind racing. "This is incredible," she said finally. "I had no idea the scope of what you do here." Blake nodded. "It's rewarding work, but it's not easy. Funding is always a challenge, and there's never enough time or resources to help everyone who needs it." Catherine hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "I'd like to help. Not just with a donation. I want to get involved. I think my skills and resources could make a real difference." Blake raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "That's a big commitment, Ms. Maxwell." "I know," she said, her voice firm. "But I've spent my entire career building a company. Maybe it's time I started building something that matters in a different way." Blake studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, let's see what we can do together." Laying the foundation. Over the next few weeks, Catherine immersed herself in the work of the Veterans Transition Alliance. She met with staff, attended support group meetings, and even visited a local business that had hired several veterans through the Alliance's job placement program. But she didn't stop there. Using her business acumen and extensive network, Catherine began laying the groundwork for a new initiative, a public-private partnership that would bring together corporations, nonprofits, and government agencies to address veterans' needs on a larger scale. She envisioned a world where every veteran had access to the resources they needed to thrive, not just survive. Blake was initially skeptical of her ambitious plans, but as he watched her work, he began to see the potential. Catherine's drive and determination were undeniable, and her ability to rally support was unmatched. For Catherine, the work was exhausting but exhilarating. For the first time in years, she felt like she was doing something that truly mattered. The seed of purpose that Blake had planted was growing into something far bigger than she had ever imagined. And though she didn't know it yet, the changes she was making wouldn't just transform the lives of veterans, they would transform her own life as well. Building bridges, breaking barriers. Catherine Maxwell stood in the middle of a bustling conference room, her phone vibrating incessantly on the table beside her. Papers and presentations were scattered across the polished oak surface, evidence of the ambitious project she had poured herself into over the last several months. The energy in the room was palpable as Catherine, Commander Andrew Blake, and a team of staff and volunteers from the Veterans Transition Alliance finalized their plan for a groundbreaking initiative, the Maxwell-Blake Veterans Network. The Maxwell-Blake Veterans Network aimed to provide a unified platform where veterans could access job training, housing support, mental health services, and mentorship opportunities. Catherine had envisioned it as more than just a charity. It was a systemic change, a bridge connecting veterans with the civilian world and showing businesses the untapped potential of hiring and supporting former service members. But the road to this point hadn't been smooth. The first big challenge. A few weeks earlier, Catherine had convened a meeting with executives from several major corporations to pitch the idea. It was a high-stakes affair, the kind of meeting she used to dominate without breaking a sweat. But this time, the stakes felt different. This wasn't about increasing her company's market share or landing a lucrative deal. It was about convincing these powerful players to invest in a mission bigger than their bottom lines. As she clicked through her presentation, she could see the skepticism etched on their faces. The executives peppered her with questions. How does this align with our corporate objectives? What's the ROI on something like this? Why veterans specifically? There are so many causes out there. Catherine felt the familiar flicker of irritation she used to feel when clients questioned her strategies. But this time, she didn't respond with sharp retorts or slick rebuttals. Instead, she took a breath and drew on what she had learned from Blake and the veterans she'd met. "Let me tell you a story," she said, stepping away from the podium. The room grew quiet as she recounted the story of David Carter, the veteran with a prosthetic leg she had met at Blake's fundraiser. She described his struggle to find work after his service, the rejection letters he received, and how he almost gave up hope, until the Veterans Transition Alliance helped him land a job as a project manager at a local construction firm. David didn't just take that job, Catherine said, her voice steady and filled with conviction. He transformed that company. His discipline, problem-solving skills, and leadership qualities elevated the entire team. That's what veterans bring to the table: resilience, dedication, and a perspective you can't teach in a classroom. By the time she finished, the room had shifted. The skepticism hadn't disappeared entirely, but there was something new: curiosity. A few of the executives began nodding. One raised his hand, asking how his company could get involved. Catherine left that meeting with commitments from 3 major corporations and a renewed sense of purpose. Expanding horizons. Catherine and Blake knew that corporate partnerships were just one piece of the puzzle. To create a truly sustainable network, they needed buy-in from local communities, government agencies, and most importantly, the veterans themselves. Blake had insisted on taking Catherine on a listening tour, visiting veterans groups in small towns and cities across the state. These meetings were a far cry from the sleek boardrooms Catherine was used to. They took place in community centers, church basements, and occasionally someone's living room. The veterans were candid, sometimes painfully so, about their struggles and frustrations. "I'm tired of being treated like a charity case," one man said during a meeting in a small-town VFO. "I don't want handouts. I want a chance to prove myself." A young woman added, "The programs out there are so scattered. It's like a maze trying to figure out what's available and who to talk to. Half the time, I just give up." Catherine took copious notes, asking questions and listening intently. The feedback was invaluable, shaping the network into something that would truly address veterans' needs. Blake, watching her work, couldn't help but feel a grudging admiration. Catherine's transformation from a detached corporate executive to an empathetic advocate was evident in the way she connected with the veterans, her sincerity breaking down barriers, facing resistance. Not everyone was on board with Catherine's vision. As word about the Maxwell Blake Veterans Network spread, it attracted both support and criticism. Some accused Catherine of using the project as a PR stunt to rehabilitate her image after the parking lot incident. Others doubted her ability to relate to veterans' struggles, pointing to her privileged background. Blake, ever the pragmatist, advised her to ignore the noise. "Focus on the mission," he said. "The work will speak for itself." But Catherine wasn't content to let the criticisms go unaddressed. She decided to hold a public town hall, inviting both supporters and skeptics to discuss the initiative openly. The event was packed, with a mix of veterans, community leaders, and curious onlookers. Standing on the stage, Catherine felt a familiar surge of nerves. But as she scanned the room, she reminded herself of why she was there. This wasn't about her. It was about the people she had met, the stories she had heard, and the lives she hoped to impact. For over an hour, she fielded questions and listened to concerns. When one attendee accused her of being out of touch, Catherine didn't bristle. Instead, she shared her own journey, her initial ignorance, her encounter with Blake, and how meeting veterans had opened her eyes. "I won't pretend to fully understand the sacrifices you've made," she said, her voice unwavering. "But I'm here to learn. And I'm here to use every resource at my disposal to make sure those sacrifices are honored in meaningful ways." By the end of the night, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. People approached Catherine, offering their support and sharing their own stories. Even some of the skeptics seemed to soften, their questions turning into conversations. The ripple effect. As the Maxwell Blake Veterans Network began to take shape, Catherine saw the ripple effect of their work. One day, she visited a veteran who had just completed the network's job training program and landed a position at a tech startup. The man, a former Army mechanic named Lewis, showed her around his modest apartment, beaming with pride. "This is the first stable place I've had in years," he said. "I used to think no one cared about guys like me. But now I feel like I've got a shot." Lewis's story was one of many. Catherine and Blake received letters, emails, and phone calls from veterans and their families, thanking them for the opportunities the network had provided. The stories fueled Catherine's determination, reminding her of why she had taken on this challenge. A moment of reflection. Late one night, Catherine found herself back in the Veterans Transition Alliance office, going over plans for the network's official launch. The building was quiet, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Blake walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You're still here?" he asked, setting a cup on the desk in front of her. Catherine smiled tiredly. "There's a lot to do." Blake sat across from her, studying her for a moment. "You know, when I first met you, I never would have guessed we'd end up here." Catherine chuckled. "Neither would I." Blake leaned back in his chair, a rare smile softening his features. "You've come a long way, Catherine. This is bigger than either of us imagined." Catherine looked around the office, at the plans spread out before her. For the first time in her life, her success didn't feel measured by profits or accolades. It felt measured by the lives she was touching, the community she was building, and the hope she was inspiring. "It's only the beginning," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. The network's breaking point. The launch of the Maxwell Blake Veterans Network was just a few weeks away, and the energy around the project had reached a fever pitch. The initiative had grown far beyond Catherine Maxwell's initial vision. Partnerships had been forged with major corporations, local governments, and nonprofits, creating a multifaceted support system for veterans. Plans for job fairs, mental health workshops, and housing aid programs were rolling out across multiple cities. Media outlets were covering the network's progress, and Catherine found herself hailed as a trailblazer in social responsibility. Yet, as the project grew, so did the challenges. The weight of expectations. Catherine sat in a cramped office at the Veterans Transition Alliance headquarters, a far cry from the sleek glass-walled boardrooms she was accustomed to. She was flanked by Commander Andrew Blake and their core team of volunteers and staff. A whiteboard at the front of the room was filled with scribbled notes and timelines. "We're stretched too thin," Blake said, his tone clipped but calm. "The demand is higher than we anticipated, and we don't have the resources to meet it. We need to scale back." "Scale back?" Catherine shot back, her voice edged with frustration. "We can't. Veterans are already counting on us. Scaling back isn't an option." Blake folded his arms, his steady blue eyes meeting hers. "And what happens when we overpromise and underdeliver? This isn't the corporate world, Catherine. These are people's lives." The tension in the room was palpable. Catherine knew Blake was right. Logistically, the network was facing serious challenges. The number of veterans applying for assistance had nearly tripled in just 2 months. The housing program was at capacity, the job training classes had waitlists, and their small team was working long hours just to keep up. Still, Catherine couldn't stomach the idea of turning anyone away. For the first time in her life, she felt truly responsible for more than her bottom line, and the weight of it was overwhelming. "We'll figure it out," she said finally, her voice softer but no less determined. "We always do." A breaking point. The stress of the growing operation began to take its toll on everyone involved, especially Catherine. She was working longer hours than ever, splitting her time between managing Maxwell Enterprises and building the network. Her phone buzzed constantly with emails, texts, and calls. Meetings stretched late into the night, leaving her physically and emotionally drained. One evening, after back-to-back meetings, Catherine found herself alone in her penthouse. The city lights shimmered outside her window, but they no longer felt like a symbol of her success. She stared at her reflection in the glass, barely recognizing the woman she saw. Her once polished demeanor was replaced by tired eyes and a heaviness in her chest she couldn't shake. A text from Blake interrupted her thoughts. "We need to talk. Emergency meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m. The crisis." The next morning, the team gathered in the same small office. Blake wasted no time getting to the point. "Our funding isn't keeping up with our growth," he said. "If we don't make some hard decisions, this whole thing could collapse." Catherine felt her stomach sink. She had worked tirelessly to secure funding, leveraging every contact and resource she had. But the scale of the network's expansion had outpaced even her most optimistic projections. "What are our options?" she asked, forcing herself to stay calm. Blake exchanged a glance with the network's finance director, a no-nonsense woman named Carla. Carla adjusted her glasses and spoke bluntly. "We need a major influx of cash, or we'll have to cut services. Housing support and mental health programs are the most resource-intensive. Scaling them back would buy us some time." "No," Catherine said immediately. "Those are the two pillars of this network. We can't cut them." Carla frowned. "Then we need to find another funding source, and fast." The turning point. Determined to save the network, Catherine called an emergency meeting with her closest corporate allies. These were the same executives she had won over months ago, but now she needed them to commit even more. The meeting was held in a sleek conference room at the Maxwell Enterprises headquarters. Catherine stood at the head of the table, her usual air of confidence tempered by the urgency of the situation. "I won't sugarcoat this," she began. "The Maxwell Blake Veterans Network is at a critical juncture. The demand for our services is higher than we anticipated, and we're facing a funding shortfall. I'm asking for your help, not just as partners, but as leaders who have the power to make a difference." One of the executives, a man named Paul, leaned forward. "Catherine, we admire what you're doing, but this is a tough ask. Our companies have budgets and shareholders to answer to. What's the ROI on this?" Catherine took a deep breath, steadying herself. "The ROI is measured in lives," she said. "Every dollar you invest means a veteran finds stable housing, gets the mental health support they need, or lands a job that gives them purpose. The ROI isn't just about money. It's about creating a society that values the people who've sacrificed for it." The room was silent for a moment. Then Paul nodded. "I'll increase my company's commitment, but I think we need to do more than just write checks. Let's make this a national campaign." Others around the table murmured in agreement, and Catherine felt a spark of hope. A new vision. With renewed corporate support, Catherine and Blake shifted their strategy. They launched a nationwide fundraising and awareness campaign, leveraging social media, public service announcements, and events to rally public support. They also introduced a mentorship program, connecting veterans with business leaders who could guide them as they transitioned into civilian careers. The campaign was a massive success. Donations poured in from individuals and organizations across the country. The network expanded its reach, opening new training centers and housing programs in additional cities. Catherine and Blake traveled frequently, speaking at events and meeting with veterans to ensure the programs were addressing their needs. A personal connection. Despite the success, Catherine remained deeply involved in the day-to-day operations. One afternoon, during a visit to a job training center, she met a young veteran named Mia. Mia had served as a communications specialist in the Army, but struggled to find work after leaving the military. She spoke candidly about her feelings of inadequacy and the challenges of adapting to civilian life. Catherine listened intently, offering encouragement and sharing her own journey of transformation. By the end of their conversation, Mia smiled for the first time, expressing hope for the future. It was moments like these that reminded Catherine why she had started this journey. The network wasn't just about programs or funding. It was about people. It was about showing veterans like Mia that they were seen, valued, and supported. A new Catherine Maxwell. As the network grew stronger, so did Catherine. The woman who had once defined herself by her corporate achievements now found fulfillment in a different kind of success. Her life was no longer measured by profits or prestige, but by the impact she was making in the lives of others. One evening after a long day, Blake found Catherine sitting outside the Alliance headquarters, staring up at the stars. "You all right?" he asked, sitting down beside her. Catherine nodded, a small smile on her face. "I was just thinking about how far we've come, and how far we still have to go." Blake chuckled. "That's the thing about missions like this. They never really end." Catherine glanced at him. "Good. I'm not done yet." The legacy begins. The inaugural gala for the Maxwell Blake Veterans Network was held in a transformed airplane hangar at a retired military base. The venue was chosen deliberately, a symbol of the transition from service to civilian life. Veterans, corporate executives, government officials, and community leaders gathered under strings of lights and towering American flags, united by the shared mission of honoring and supporting those who had served. Catherine Maxwell stood near the edge of the bustling room, taking it all in. She'd spent years at high-profile events, mingling with power players and closing deals, but this felt different. The energy in the room wasn't about power or wealth. It was about hope and purpose. The heart of the evening. Commander Andrew Blake approached her, a rare smile softening his usually serious expression. "You've outdone yourself, Maxwell. This is incredible." Catherine smiled back, her nerves beginning to settle. "It's not about me, Andrew. It's about them." She nodded toward a table where a group of veterans laughed and shared stories, their families by their sides. Before Blake could respond, a member of the event staff approached Catherine, handing her a microphone. It was time for her to address the crowd. Catherine made her way to the stage, her heels clicking softly against the polished concrete floor. The room quieted as she reached the podium, all eyes on her. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady. "When I started this journey, I thought I understood what success looked like. I thought it was about climbing the ladder, reaching the top, and staying there. But over the past year, I've learned that success isn't about standing above others. It's about standing with them." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. "Tonight, we celebrate not just the launch of the Maxwell Blake Veterans Network, but the resilience, strength, and courage of the men and women who have served this country. This isn't just a network, it's a promise that no veteran will be left behind, a promise that their sacrifices will be met with opportunities, not obstacles." Catherine's voice caught for a moment as she thought about all the veterans she'd met: David, Alina, Louis, Mia, and so many others. The Maxwell Blake Veterans Network isn't the work of one person. It's the work of a community that believes in lifting each other up and building bridges where there were once walls. The room erupted into applause, and Catherine stepped back, letting Blake take the stage. The unexpected proposal. As Blake spoke passionately about the programs the network had launched, Catherine stepped down from the stage and moved to a quieter corner of the room. She was reflecting on the journey that had brought her here when she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Mia, the young veteran she had met at the job training center. Mia was holding a small folder, her hands trembling slightly. "I didn't mean to bother you, Ms. Maxwell," Maya said, her voice tentative. But I wanted to give you something. Catherine smiled warmly. Mia, it's no bother at all. What's this? Mia handed her the folder, which contained a handwritten letter and a drawing. The letter detailed Maya's journey, from her struggles with PTSD and unemployment to the hope she had found through the network. The drawing was a pencil sketch of Catherine standing with Commander Blake, the Veterans Transition Alliance logo in the background. I'm studying graphic design now, Maya said, her voice gaining strength, and I wanted to thank you for everything you've done. You believed in us when so many others didn't. Catherine felt a lump rise in her throat as she studied the drawing. It was a powerful reminder of the lives the network had touched. Mia, this is beautiful, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you. You've just given me more motivation than you could ever imagine. The challenges ahead. As the evening wound down, Catherine and Blake retreated to a quiet corner of the hangar, watching as guests slowly began to leave. The event had been a resounding success, but Catherine couldn't shake the weight of what still lay ahead. You know this is just the beginning, she said, breaking the comfortable silence. Blake nodded. It always is. The needs are endless. For every veteran we've helped, there are 10 more waiting for a chance. That's what keeps me awake at night, Catherine admitted, knowing there's always more to do. Blake studied her for a moment, then said, You're not in this alone. None of us are. That's what makes this work. People coming together, each doing their part. The ripple effect. Over the next several months, the Maxwell Blake Veterans Network expanded rapidly. New centers opened in cities across the country, offering job training, mental health services, and housing support. The network's mentorship program connected thousands of veterans with leaders in their communities, helping them build careers and regain their sense of purpose. Catherine remained deeply involved, splitting her time between her corporate responsibilities and the network. She became a fixture at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, job fairs, and town halls, always listening, learning, and advocating for those the network served. One day, during a visit to a newly opened center in Denver, Catherine met a man named Tom, a Vietnam veteran who had been homeless for over a decade before finding help through the network. Tom's story was one of resilience and redemption, and as he spoke, Catherine realized just how far the ripple effect of their work had spread. You didn't just save my life, Tom said, his voice steady but emotional. You gave me a reason to believe in it again. The legacy. As the first anniversary of the Maxwell Blake Veterans Network approached, Catherine found herself reflecting on everything they had accomplished. She had changed, profoundly. The woman who once defined herself by profits and power had found a deeper purpose, one rooted in service and compassion. The anniversary event was held at the network's flagship center, a sprawling facility that housed classrooms, counseling offices, and a community space. As Catherine and Blake stood before a crowd of veterans, staff, and supporters, she felt an overwhelming sense of pride, not in herself, but in what they had built together. Blake leaned over and said, You know, Maxwell, this thing is bigger than either of us now. Catherine smiled. Good, that's exactly how it should be. As they cut the ribbon on yet another expansion, Catherine realized that the Maxwell Blake Veterans Network wasn't just a project or a passion. It was a legacy. A legacy built on the idea that true success wasn't about individual achievement, but about lifting others and creating a better future for everyone. And for the first time in her life, Catherine felt truly fulfilled.